The Forbidden Daguerreotype, a historical account by Margaret Whitmore, Folklorist, The Discovery. The autumn of night brought with it an unexpected revelation that would forever change my understanding of ancient practices and the lengths to which institutions would go to suppress certain truths. I am Dr. Margaret Whitmore, a folklorist specializing in pre-Christian European traditions, and what I am about to recount may seem fantastical to the modern reader. Yet I assure you, every word is documented and verified through sources I can no longer safely reveal. It began with a letter from my late mentor, Professor Edmund Wood of Cambridge University. The envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with black wax, arrived at my London residence on a particularly dreary October morning. The postmark indicated it had been held by solicitors for nearly 3 years, released only upon certain conditions outlined in Professor Blackwood's will. My dear Margaret, the letter began in his familiar, speedery handwriting. If you are reading this, then I have passed beyond the veil, and the time has come for certain secrets to be revealed. In my study, behind the false panel you helped me install during your graduate studies, you will find a collection that the Royal Anthropological Society has spent considerable effort to suppress. Among these items is a photographic plate that captures something that should not exist, yet undeniably does. The letter continued with specific instructions for accessing his hidden archive, and a stern warning about the potential consequences of revealing its content. The photograph, it wrote, was taken during the Samhain ritual of 1890 in the village of Thornwick, Scotland. What it depicts challenges everything we thought we knew about the persistence of ancient practices in the modern era. I took the first train to Cambridge the following morning. Professor Blackwood's study remained exactly as I remembered it, books stacked in precarious towers, artifacts scattered across every available surface, and the persistent smell of pipe tobacco and old parchment. The false panel, concealed behind a bookshelf containing his collection of Celtic mythology texts, opened with the same soft click I remembered from my student days. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a collection of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be ritual implements. But it was the daguerreotype plate that immediately captured my attention. Even in the dim light of the study, I could see that this was no ordinary photograph. The image seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality, as if the very act of capturing it had somehow trapped something beyond the physical realm. The photograph depicted a circle of 13 figures in elaborate ceremonial dress, standing around what appeared to be an ancient stone altar. But it was not the participants that made this image so extraordinary. It was what appeared to be manifesting above the altar itself, a translucent and shifting form that seemed to exist between the physical and spiritual worlds, captured at the precise moment of its materialization. Accompanying the photograph was a detailed journal entry dated November 1st, 1890, written by one Reverend Thomas Ashford, who had apparently witnessed and documented the ritual. His account, written in a shaking hand, described events that would have been dismissed as fantasy were it not for the photographic evidence before me. The old ways persist, Ashford had written, despite our best efforts to civilize this remote community. What I witnessed tonight in Thornwick defies all rational explanation, yet the evidence of my own eyes cannot be denied. The photograph, taken by the traveling photographer Mr. James Whitlock, captures something that should not exist in our modern Christian world. As I studied the image more closely, I began to notice details that became increasingly disturbing. The faces of the participants, though partially obscured by ceremonial masks and hoods, showed expressions of ecstatic terror. Their positioning around the altar followed patterns I recognized from my studies of ancient Celtic ritual sites. But most unsettling of all was the realization that the manifestation above the altar appeared to be looking directly at the camera, directly at anyone who would view this image in the years to come. The implications were staggering. If this photograph was genuine, and my initial examination suggested it was, then it provided concrete evidence that ancient pagan practices had not only survived into the late 19th century, but had achieved results that challenged our understanding of reality itself. He spent the remainder of that day cataloging the other items in Professor Blackwood's hidden collection. There were letters from various academic institutions, all bearing the same message. Certain research was to be discontinued, certain findings were not to be published, and certain evidence was to be surrendered to appropriate authorities. It became clear that my mentor had been part of a broader effort to document and preserve knowledge that powerful forces preferred to keep hidden. As evening approached, I carefully packed the daguerreotype and accompanying documents, knowing that I was now the keeper of a secret that had cost my mentor his academic reputation and possibly his life. The weight of that responsibility settled upon me like a shroud as I made my way back to London, the forbidden photograph hidden beneath my coat. That night, as I sat in my study examining the image under a magnifying glass, I began to notice something that chilled me to the bone. In the background of the photograph, barely visible among the shadows of the ancient stones, were other figures, watchers who had not been part of the ritual but had been present nonetheless. Their faces, when I could make them out, bore expressions of hunger and anticipation that suggested they were not entirely human. I realized then that I was not merely looking at documentation of an ancient ritual, but at evidence of something far more profound and terrifying. The photograph had captured a moment when the boundaries between worlds had grown thin, when ancient powers had been successfully summoned into our reality. And now, 33 years later, I held the only remaining proof of that impossible night. My investigation into the origins of the forbidden daguerreotype led me to the archives of the Admirgraph Photographic Society, where I hoped to find records of James Whitlock, the traveling photographer, mentioned in Reverend Ashford's journal. What I discovered there would prove to be both illuminating and deeply troubling. Whitlock's membership records indicated he had been a respected practitioner of the photographic arts, specializing in documentary work throughout the Scottish Highlands. His portfolio included conventional portraits, landscape studies, and ethnographic documentation of rural customs, exactly the sort of work that would have brought him to Thornwick during the autumn of. However, it was his personal correspondence, preserved in the Society's archives, that revealed the true story behind that fateful night. In a letter dated November 15th, 1890, addressed to his colleague and fellow photographer William Henderson, Whitlock described his experience in terms that grew increasingly frantic as the account progressed. "My dear Henderson," the letter began, "I write to you from Edinburgh, having fled Thornwick, in circumstances I can barely bring myself to describe. The commission seemed straightforward enough. Document the harvest festival customs of this remote Highland village for the Royal Geographic Society. What I witnessed, and what my camera captured, defies all rational explanation." Whitlock went on to describe how he had arrived in Thornwick on October 30th, expecting to photograph quaint folk customs and perhaps some colorful local characters. The village, he noted, seemed ordinary enough during daylight hours, a collection of stone cottages clustered around an ancient church, surrounded by the typical Highland landscape of moors and standing stones. The villagers were cordial but evasive, he wrote. When I inquired about their Samhain traditions, they exchanged glances that suggested knowledge they were reluctant to share with an outsider. It was only through the intervention of Reverend Ashford, who had apparently gained their trust during his brief tenure in the village, that I was permitted to observe their evening ceremony. The photographer's account of the ritual itself was remarkably detailed, describing elements that corroborated both the visual evidence in the daguerreotype and Reverend Ashford's journal entry. He wrote of 13 participants, each wearing robes that appeared to be made from materials far older than any textile he had encountered. The ceremonial masks, he noted, were carved from what appeared to be bone and bore symbols that predated any known Celtic design. The ritual began at the stroke of midnight. Whitlock continued, with a chanting that seemed to emerge from the very stones themselves. I had positioned my camera at what I believed to be a safe distance, using the new magnesium flash powder to illuminate the scene. What happened next challenges everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. According to his account, the manifestation began as a subtle distortion in the air above the ancient altar, a shimmering that he initially attributed to heat rising from the ceremonial fires. But as the chanting intensified, this distortion began to take on a more definite form, becoming something that existed in the space between visibility and transparency. It triggered the camera's shutter at the moment when the manifestation seemed most solid, he wrote, though I confess I was operating more on instinct than conscious thought. The flash powder illuminated the scene with an intensity that seemed to paint the entity, if entity it was. And for a moment I feared I had disrupted something that should not have been disturbed. The letter went on to describe the aftermath of the photograph. The participants, rather than being angry at his documentino, their secret ritual, seemed pleased, almost triumphant. It was as if the act of photographing the manifestation had somehow validated or completed their working. They spoke among themselves in what I took to be Gaelic, Whitlock wrote, but there were words and phrases that seemed far older than any language I had encountered. When they finally acknowledged my presence, their leader, a woman of indeterminate age whose eyes held depths that suggested knowledge of things best left unknown, approached me with what I can only describe as satisfaction. The woman, according to Whitlock's account, had told him that the photograph would serve a purpose beyond mere documentation. She spoke of cycles and awakenings, he wrote, of times when the old powers would stir again and the image would serve as both proof and catalyst. He confessed he understood little of what she meant, but her words filled me with a dread that has not left me in the days since. The photographer's letter concluded with a desperate plea for advice and a warning that would prove prophetic. "He have developed a plate," it wrote, "and what it shows defies all rational explanation. Yet I cannot bring myself to destroy it, for it represents evidence of something that may be of crucial importance to future generations. I fear, however, that there are those who would go to great lengths to ensure this evidence never sees the light of day." My research into Whitlock's subsequent fate revealed the tragic accuracy of his fears. Records indicated that he had died in a fire that consumed his Edinburgh studio just 3 weeks after writing the letter to Henderson. The official investigation ruled it an accident caused by the spontaneous combustion of photographic chemicals, but Henderson's response letter, also preserved in the archives, suggested a more sinister explanation. The fire was no accident, Henderson had written to a mutual colleague. James had become increasingly paranoid in his final weeks, claiming that he was being watched and that his studio had been searched. He had hidden the Thornwick photograph, he told me, but would not reveal its location. Now he is dead, and I fear that his concerns about the photograph's significance were well-founded. The trail of the daguerreotype from Whitlock's hidden cache to Professor Blackwood's collection remained unclear, but correspondence in my mentor's files suggested that it had passed through several hands before reaching him. Each previous owner, it seemed, had met with misfortune shortly after acquiring the image, accidents, illnesses, and mysterious disappearances that formed a pattern too consistent to be mere coincidence. As I delved deeper into the photograph's history, I began to understand why it had been so zealously suppressed. This was not merely evidence of surviving pagan practices, but proof that those practices could achieve results that challenged the very foundations of modern scientific understanding. The implications for religious, academic, and governmental institutions were staggering. Determined to uncover the full truth behind the forbidden daguerreotype, I resolved to visit Thornwick myself. The journey to the remote highland village required considerable planning, as it lay far from any major transportation routes and was accessible only by a combination of rail, coach, and foot travel that took the better part of 3 days. My first glimpse of Thornwick came as I crested a hill overlooking the valley in which it nestled. The village appeared much as Whitlock had described it 33 years earlier, a cluster of stone cottages arranged around a medieval church, with a landscape dominated by ancient standing stones that predated any historical record. What struck me immediately was the sense of isolation that pervaded the place, as if it existed in a pocket of time separate from the modern world. The villagers' reception of my arrival was polite but wary. Word of my purpose, researching local folklore and customs, seemed to spread quickly through the small community, and I noticed that conversations would cease abruptly when I approached. It was clear that Thornwick harbored secrets that its inhabitants were reluctant to share with outsiders. He had arranged to stay at the village-only inn, a modest establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Flora MacLeod. She was perhaps 60 years of age, with the weathered features common to Highland folk, but her eyes held an intelligence and awareness that suggested she knew more about the village history than she was willing to reveal. "You'll be the folklorist from London," she said as she showed me to my room. It was a statement rather than a question, confirming that my arrival had been anticipated. We don't get many visitors interested in the old way. Over the course of my first evening in Thornwick, I attempted to engage Mrs. MacLeod and the inn's few other patrons in conversation about local traditions. Their responses were carefully neutral, acknowledging the existence of oral customs while providing no specific details. It was only when I mentioned Professor Blackwood's name that I detected a subtle shift in their demeanor. "Aye, we remember the professor," Mrs. MacLeod said quietly. "He came here some years back, asking questions much like yours. A learned man, but perhaps too curious for his own good." The following morning, I began a systematic exploration of the village and its surroundings. The church, dedicated to St. Columba, showed clear evidence of having been built upon a much older foundation. Celtic symbols were carved into stones that had obviously been repurposed from an earlier structure, and the churchyard contained graves dating back several centuries. It was the standing stones, however, that proved most intriguing. The circle consisted of 13 monoliths, arranged in a pattern that corresponded exactly to the positioning of the ritual participants in Whitlock's photograph. At the center of the circle stood what appeared to be an altar stone, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use and marked with symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. As I examined the stones more closely, I noticed that several bore what appeared to be relatively recent additions, carved symbols that were clearly not part of the original construction. These newer markings included dates, the most recent of which was Dientos Nolotte, confirming that the site had indeed been used for the ritual captured in the forbidden daguerreotype. My investigation was interrupted by the arrival of the current village minister, Reverend Donald McBride. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the stern demeanor typical of Highland clergy, but his eyes held a haunted quality that suggested he was aware of forces beyond his theological training. "You'll be studying our local history," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Interest, you'll find our community to be thoroughly Christian in its practices." I assured him that my interest was purely academic, but his response suggested that he was not entirely convinced. "There are some aspects of local history," he said carefully, "that are best left undisturbed. The past has a way of reaching into the present when it's given too much attention." That evening, as I sat in the inn's common room reviewing my notes, Mrs. MacLeod approached with a cup of tea and an expression that suggested she had something important to say. She glanced around to ensure we were alone before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "You're asking about the old ways," she said, "and there are those in the village who remember, but there are also those who would prefer that certain knowledge remain buried." She paused, studying my face carefully. "Your Professor Blackwood, he understood the importance of preserving what others would destroy. Perhaps you do as well." I confirmed that I share my mentor's commitment to documenting and preserving cultural traditions, regardless of how controversial they might be. Mrs. MacLeod nodded slowly, as if reaching a decision. There are still those among us who remember the night the photograph was taken, she said. My grandmother was one of the 13 who participated in the ritual. She passed the knowledge to my mother, and my mother to me. The old ways never truly died in Thornwick. They simply learned to hide. She went on to explain that the ritual captured in Whitlock's daguerreotype had been part of an ancient tradition that predated Christianity in the region by thousands of years. The practice involved calling upon powers that existed beyond the physical world, seeking their aid in ensuring the community's survival through the dark months of winter. The manifestation you see in the photograph, she said, is what we call the Guardian, a protective spirit that has watched over Thornwick since time immemorial. The ritual of Donente was particularly significant because it marked the end of a cycle that occurs only once every 33 years. The implications of her words struck me immediately. If the cycle she described was accurate, then 1993 would mark the beginning of a new period of spiritual activity in Thornwick. The timing of my arrival, I realized, was no coincidence. The Guardian stirs again. MacLeod continued, and there are signs that suggest the next great working approaches. The photograph your professor preserved may prove crucial to what is to come. As she spoke, I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere of the end. The air seemed to thicken, and I could hear what sounded like distant chanting, carried on the wind. Mrs. MacLeod noticed my reaction and nodded grimly. It begins again, she said. The question is whether you will choose to witness it or flee, as so many others have done. The decision to remain in Thornwick and witness what Mrs. MacLeod had hinted at was not one I made lightly. Every instinct of self-preservation urged me to depart immediately, yet my commitment to documenting the truth compelled me to stay. As October 24, 1923 approached, the very atmosphere of the village seemed to change, becoming charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. In the days leading up to Samhain, I observed subtle but significant changes in the behavior of the villagers. Conversations became more hushed, and there was a sense of anticipation that permeated every interaction. I noticed that certain individuals, tertersen in total, I eventually realized began to move with a purposefulness that suggested they were preparing for something of great importance. Miss MacLeod had become my unofficial guide to the village hidden traditions, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who served as keepers of the old ways. She explained that the ritual I was about to witness was not merely a historical reenactment, but a living tradition that served vital purposes for the community. The Guardian must be renewed, she told me, as we walked among the standing stones 3 days before Samhain. Every 33 years, the connection between our world and the realm of the spirits grows thin, and the protective barriers that shield Thornwick must be reinforced. Without this renewal, the village would be vulnerable to forces far more malevolent than the Guardian we summon. She went on to explain that the photograph taken by Whitlock in 1990 had captured more than just a moment in time. It had somehow preserved a portion of the Guardian's essence, creating a link between the past and future manifestations. This was why the daguerreotype had been so zealously sought by those who wished to suppress such knowledge, and why its preservation had been crucial to the continuation of the tradition. The image serves as both anchor and catalyst, Mrs. MacLeod explained. It provides a focus for the spiritual energies and ensures that the Guardian's form remains consistent across the centuries. Without it, the ritual might summon something entirely different, something that might not have the village's best interests at heart. As October 31st dawned, I could feel the anticipation reaching its peak. The wearing seemed to vibrate with potential energy, and I noticed that the standing stones appeared to emit a subtle luminescence that was visible even in daylight. Miss MacLeod had provided me with a vantage point from which I could observe the ritual without interfering, a rocky outcropping that overlooked the stone circle from a safe distance. As midnight approached, the 13 participants began to gather at the circle. I recognized several of them as villagers I had encountered during my stay, but their appearance had been transformed by elaborate ceremonial garments that seemed to be made from materials that predated any known textile traditions. The masks they wore were carved from bone and antler, decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light of the ceremonial fires. The ritual began with a chanting that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves, a harmonic resonance that I felt as much as heard. The participants moved in patterns around the central altar, their movements precise and deliberate, following choreography that had been perfected over countless generations. As the ceremony progressed, I began to notice changes in the atmosphere that mirrored those described in Whitlock's account. The air above the altar began to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was becoming malleable. The chanting intensified, and I could see that the participants were entering states of ecstatic trance, their movements becoming more fluid and otherworldly. It was then that I understood why Mrs. MacLeod had insisted I bring Professor Blackwood's daguerreotype with me. At her instruction, I hailed the photograph aloft and immediately felt a surge of energy that seemed to flow from the image into the ritual space below. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The shimmering above the altar began to coalesce into a definite form. The guardian, when it finally manifested, was both beautiful and terrifying. It appeared as a figure of shifting light and shadow, neither fully solid nor entirely ethereal. Its presence radiated a sense of ancient wisdom and protective power, but also a barely contained wildness that suggested it was not entirely benevolent. Most unsettling of all, as it had in Whitlock's photograph, the entity seemed to be aware of my presence, turning its attention toward my hiding place with an intelligence that was unmistakably non-human. The communication that followed was not conducted in any language I could understand, yet somehow I comprehended its meaning. The guardian acknowledged the role that the preserved photograph had played in maintaining the connection across the decades, and I sensed its approval of my efforts to document and preserve this knowledge. But there was also a warning, a clear indication that this information came with responsibilities and dangers that I was only beginning to understand. The ritual reached a climax as the guardian extended its influence throughout the village, reinforcing the protective barriers that shielded Thornwick from malevolent forces. He could feel the energy washing over the landscape, creating an invisible shield that would endure for another 33 years. The process was both beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of the power that lay hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly rational world. As the manifestation began to fade, the guardian's attention turned once more to me. In that moment of contact, I received a flood of images and impressions that would take me years to fully process. I saw the history of Thornwick stretching back through millennia, witnessed the countless rituals that had maintained the balance between the physical and spiritual worlds, and understood the crucial role that documentation and preservation played in ensuring the continuation of these ancient practices. When the ritual finally concluded and the participants began to disperse, I remained at my observation point, overwhelmed by what I had witnessed. Mrs. MacLeod found me there as dawn was breaking, still clutching the daguerreotype that had served as the bridge between past and present. "Now you understand," she said simply, "why some knowledge must be preserved, regardless of the cost." The journey back to London following my experience in Thornwick was fraught with a growing awareness that I was now in possession of knowledge that powerful forces would go to great lengths to suppress. The forbidden daguerreotype, which had served as a crucial component in the ritual renewal, seemed to pulse with renewed energy, as if the guardian's manifestation had somehow enhanced its already otherworldly properties. My first indication that my activities had not gone unnoticed came in the form of a telegram waiting for me upon my arrival at my London residence. The message, sent from the offices of the Royal Anthropological Society, was brief but ominous, Your recent research activities have come to our attention. Your presence is required at our offices at your earliest convenience. Urgent matters to discuss. The Royal Anthropological Society occupied an imposing Georgian building in Bloomsbury, its halls lined with artifacts and specimens from around the world. I had visited the institution many times during my academic career, but on this occasion, the atmosphere seemed distinctly unwelcoming. He was escorted not to the usual meeting rooms, but to a private office in the building's upper floors, a space I had never seen before. The man who greeted me introduced himself as Sir Reginald Blackthorne, Director of Special Collections. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding considerable authority. His office was spartanly furnished, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a single bookshelf, filled with volumes whose titles were not visible from where I sat. Whitmore. He began without preamble. We understand that you have recently come into possession of certain materials that belonged to your late mentor, Professor Blackwood. We also understand that you have been conducting research into practices that fall outside the scope of conventional academic inquiry. I confirmed that I had indeed inherited Professor Blackwood's research materials and had been investigating the historical persistence of pre-Christian traditions in remote areas of Scotland. Sir Reginald nodded, as if my response had confirmed something he already knew. The materials in question, he continued, particularly a certain photographic plate dating from the 1890s, represent a potential threat to public order and religious stability. The Royal Anthropological Society, in cooperation with other governmental and ecclesiastical authorities, has been tasked with ensuring that such materials do not fall into inappropriate hands. The conversation that followed revealed the existence of a coordinated effort to suppress evidence of supernatural phenomena that had been ongoing for decades. Sir Reginald explained that various institutions, academic, religious, and governmental, had formed an informal alliance dedicated to maintaining what they termed rational stability in British society. The common people, he said, are not equipped to process evidence that challenges their fundamental understanding of reality. The knowledge you possess, if disseminated widely, could lead to a resurgence of superstitious practices that we have spent centuries eliminating. The consequences for social order would be catastrophic. I argued that the suppression of knowledge, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be, represented a betrayal of academic principles and the public's right to understand their own cultural heritage. Sir Reginald's response was both patronizing and threatening. Academic principles are a luxury we can afford only when they do not threaten the stability of civilization itself. He said, the photograph you possess and the knowledge that accompanies it represents exactly such a threat. We are prepared to offer you a substantial compensation for surrendering these materials, along with a guarantee that your academic career will continue to flourish under our patronage. The offer was generous: a research position at Cambridge, unlimited funding for approved projects, and access to archives that were normally restricted to only the most senior scholars. But the price was clear. I would have to surrender the daguerreotype and agree never to publish or discuss my findings regarding the Thornwick ritual. I requested time to consider their proposal, and Sir Reginald agreed to give me 48 hours to reach a decision. As he left the Royal Anthropological Society's offices, however, I became aware that I was being followed. The surveillance was subtle but unmistakable. Figures who appeared at regular intervals during my journey home, always maintaining a careful distance but never entirely disappearing from view. That evening, as I sat in my study examining the daguerreotype once more, I began to notice details that I had previously overlooked. The image seemed to have changed since my return from Thornwick, showing aspects of the ritual that had not been visible before. Most disturbing of all, I could swear that the guardian's gaze had shifted, as if it was now looking directly at me with an expression of urgent warning. My contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find Miss MacLeod standing on my doorstep, her presence in London both unexpected and deeply concerning. "They came to Thornwick," she said without preamble, as I ushered her inside. Men in dark suits, asking questions about your visit and demanding to know what you had been shown. The village closed ranks, as it always does, but their presence was unsettling. She explained that the visitors had not been content with the villagers' denials and had begun conducting a systematic search of the area around the standing stone. They had brought equipment that she did not recognize, devices that seemed designed to detect or measure something beyond normal human perception. The Guardian is restless, she continued. The ritual renewal was successful, but the presence of these outsiders has disturbed the balance we worked so hard to achieve. The protective barriers are holding, but they are under strain. Mrs. MacLeod's arrival in London had not been coincidental. She had come to warn me that the forces seeking to suppress the knowledge contained in the daguerreotype were more powerful and more ruthless than I had imagined. She also brought disturbing news about the fate of others who had possessed similar evidence in the past. Professor Blackwood was not the first to die under suspicious circumstances, she revealed. There have been others, researchers, photographers, even clergy who stumbled upon evidence they were not meant to find. The pattern is always the same. First comes the offer of cooperation, then the threats, and finally, accidents. The implications were clear. My refusal to cooperate with Sir Reginald's demands would likely result in consequences far more severe than mere academic ostracism. Yet, the alternative, surrendering the daguerreotype and allowing this crucial evidence to disappear, was equally unthinkable. As we discussed potential courses of action, Mrs. MacLeod revealed that there were others like her, keepers of ancient knowledge, who had learned to operate in the shadows, preserving traditions and evidence despite official suppression. This network, she explained, had been responsible for ensuring that the daguerreotype had survived the decades between Whitlock's death and its acquisition by Professor Blackwood. The photograph must survive, she said firmly, not just as historical evidence, but as a living link to powers that may be needed again in the future. The cycle of renewal in Thornwick is just one part of a larger pattern that spans the entire British Isles. If that pattern is broken, the consequences will extend far beyond a single Highland village. The decision to defy the Royal Anthropological Society's demands was not one I made lightly, but Miss MacLeod's revelations about the broader network of suppression made it clear that surrender was not an option. The forbidden daguerreotype represented more than just historical evidence. It was a crucial component in maintaining protective barriers that shielded communities throughout Britain from forces that most people could not even imagine. Our plan, developed over several intense discussions in my London study, involved creating multiple copies of the daguerreotype using the most advanced photographic techniques available. Miss MacLeod revealed that her network had access to resources and expertise that rivaled those of any official institution accumulated over decades of operating in secret. To preserve threatened knowledge, the process of reproduction proved more complex than anticipated. The original daguerreotype possessed qualities that seemed to resist conventional copying methods. Multiple attempts using standard photographic equipment resulted in images that captured the physical details of the ritual, but lacked the otherworldly energy that made the original so significant. It was only when we incorporated elements from the ritual tradition itself, timing the photography to coincide with specific lunar phases and using materials that had been consecrated according to ancient practices, that we achieved results that preserved the essential qualities of Whitlock's original work. During this period, the surveillance of my activity intensified the tacti. Sir Reginald's agents made no attempt to conceal their presence, clearly intending to intimidate me into compliance. My correspondence was intercepted, my visitors were monitored, and on several occasions I returned home to find evidence that my study had been searched during my absence. The pressure reached its peak when I received a visit from Reverend Dr. Charles Pemberton, representing what he described as concerned ecclesiastical authorities. His message was blunt. The Church of England viewed the evidence contained in the daguerreotype as a direct threat to Christian doctrine and social order. The offer represented was similar to Sir Reginald's, but the underlying threat was far more explicit. "The Church has dealt with such challenges before," he said, his tone carrying implications that chilled me to the bone. "Those who persist in promoting dangerous superstitions often find that their academic careers and sometimes their lives come to unfortunate ends. We would prefer to resolve this matter through cooperation rather than alternative methods." It was Miss MacLeod who provided the solution to our dilemma. Her network had identified safe houses throughout Britain where copies of the daguerreotype could be hidden, along with documentation that would ensure the knowledge survived even if we did not. More importantly, they had established connections with similar preservation efforts in other countries, creating an international network dedicated to protecting evidence of supernatural phenomena from official suppression. The distribution of the copies took place over the course of several weeks, with each reproduction being secretly transported to a different location. Some went to private collectors who specialized in occult materials, others to academic institutions in countries where such research was more tolerated, and still others to remote communities where ancient traditions continued to be practiced in secret. The original daguerreotype, however, requires special handling. Mrs. MacLeod revealed that it needed to be returned to Thornwick, where it would serve as the focal point for future ritual renewals. The photograph had become more than just documentation. It was now an integral part of the spiritual infrastructure that protected the village and, by extension, the broader network of communities that maintain similar practices. The journey back to Thornwick was undertaken under cover of darkness, using routes and methods that had been developed over generations to move sensitive materials without detection. Mr. MacLeod's network proved remarkably sophisticated, employing techniques that would have impressed any intelligence service. Our arrival in the village coincided with the new moon, a timing that Mrs. MacLeod insisted was crucial for the proper installation of the daguerreotype in its permanent resting place. The ceremony that followed was simpler than the great ritual I had witnessed on Samhain, but no less significant. The photograph was placed within a specially prepared chamber beneath the central altar stone, where it would remain until the next cycle of renewal began. As we completed the installation, I felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circuit that had been broken for 33 years had finally been restored. The guardian's presence, though not visible, was unmistakably felt, a benevolent watchfulness that confirmed the success of our efforts. The return journey to London was accomplished without incident, but I knew that my defiance of the suppression efforts would have consequences. Sure enough, within days of my return, I received notice that my academic positions had been terminated, and my access to university resources revoked. The official reason cited irregularities in research methodologies in pursuit of investigations outside approved academic parameters. The personal cost of preserving the forbidden daguerreotype was significant, but the knowledge that this crucial evidence would survive made the sacrifice worthwhile. Miss MacLeod's network provided alternative means of support, and I found that there were other scholars, researchers, and practitioners who valued truth over institutional approval. In the years that followed, I continued my research into the persistence of ancient traditions, working now outside the constraints of official academia. The network that had preserved the daguerreotype proved to be vast and sophisticated, encompassing individuals and communities throughout Europe and beyond. I learned that the suppression efforts I had encountered were part of a much larger campaign that had been ongoing for centuries, aimed at eliminating evidence of supernatural phenomena and the practices that could access them. The forbidden daguerreotype of the Teotihuacans named a Thornwick ritual now rests in its proper place, serving as both historical record and spiritual anchor for future generations. The knowledge it represents that the boundaries between worlds are far more permeable than modern science admits, and that ancient practices can achieve results that challenge our understanding of reality, continues to be preserved and transmitted by those who understand its importance. As I write this account, In 1924, I am aware that the forces of suppression have not abandoned their efforts. They continue to seek out and eliminate evidence that challenges their vision of a rational, controllable world. But they face an opponent that has learned to adapt and survive through millennia of persecution, the keepers of ancient wisdom, who understand that some knowledge is too important to be lost, regardless of the cost of preserving it. The photograph taken by James Whitlock on that fateful night in Estilton-on-Enta captured more than just an image. It preserved a moment when the impossible became visible, when the ancient powers that shape our world revealed themselves to mortal eyes. That evidence now rests safely beyond the reach of those who would destroy it, waiting for the time when humanity will once again need proof that there are forces in this world far older and more powerful than our modern institutions dare to acknowledge. The cycle continues, the guardian watches, and the truth endures. Dr. Margaret Whitmore's account ends here. Her subsequent fate remains unknown, though records suggest she continued her research into suppressed historical phenomena until her disappearance. The network she described continues to operate, preserving evidence and knowledge that official institutions prefer to ignore. The village of Thornwick still exists, though it remains as remote and secretive as ever, its ancient traditions protected by those who understand their true significance. This document represents one of the few surviving accounts of the systematic suppression of supernatural evidence in early 20th century Britain. Whether one believes in the reality of the phenomena described, the historical record of such suppression efforts is well documented and continues to this day.